Yes, I do have some interesting charts to show you. I'm not going to perhaps guide you through them in as much detail as Michael guided you through his, but I wanted to show you that there is a very solid fact base supporting my comments today, and that I'm not just making a bunch of random assertions. Let me start, however, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Turrbal people, and paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. There's another set of acknowledgements that I need to make as well. I'd like to thank McKinsey and Company, the Business Council of Australia and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency for access to the data underpinning elements of my presentation and support in the analytic work. So given I mentioned WGEA, you can probably guess a little bit of where my presentation is going to take us today. But what I want to address today is the topic of how we can engage all of our citizens in the Australian economy. Without inclusive economic engagement, we leave ourselves open to the potential for the rampant populism now seen in the United Kingdom and the United States. Isn't it interesting that those two places are called united? For, in my mind, they have never been less united. In considering the Australian economy and its prospects for the future, we can never forget that we are the population of the state of Texas living in the landmass of the United States. Our relatively small population means a relatively small local labour force and a pool of savings that may be high per capita, but will never finance all the investments that are available in this country. This drives us to be an open economy. And I think we have successfully navigated the world of the open economy to allow us to punch well above our weight. We are a G20 economy, but not in the top 50 countries by population. We benefit from foreign investment in projects that create jobs and generate economic taxable activity. We clearly do not have the capacity to produce all the goods and services we want to buy, and I think we deploy comparative advantage well. We export what we do best and import what we're relatively less efficient at producing. It's factual that our economic opportunity and living standards overall are much, much higher as a result of the foreign trade and investment of our open economy. What we have done less well, like much of the world, is to ensure that workers in trade-exposed industries have the capacity to adjust by providing skills training in advance of change. So we should keep our eyes on this. So my first policy prescription for engaging all Australians is to continue our open economy stance, but to ensure structural shifts do not disadvantage some workers. You know, because as Bill Shorten said, engaging all Australians is a matter of jobs and providing equal opportunity to everyone to have a meaningful job. So what I'm going to examine is labour participation and how it's driven growth in Australia, and provide some ideas as to how we might encourage greater participation. And as Michael pointed out, our economy has been in the enviable position of growing GDP year on year for a long time. Today, slow economic growth is being felt in households across the country, and we see this at Wesfarmers in our retail trade figures. Real wages growth is positive, but living standards are being squeezed as household disposable income continues to stagnate. We have the end of an extended period of high labour demand for resources development coming at the same time as a rise in energy prices. Employment has been growing, although mainly in part-time jobs, and the number of workers seeking more hours of work is close to record highs. Michael said it, consumers need more income and the confidence to spend it. Now, increasing the number of people working has been a key driver of Australia's economic growth. And you see this in the 25% in the top part of this chart, 1993 income to 2005 income. And a lot of the increase was driven by a steady increase in the participation of women in the workforce, mainly in part-time employment. But additional labour has been less of a factor since 2005, as this chart shows. Capital investment actually took over. Michael has noted that business remains reluctant to invest despite a set of fundamentals that would generally favour rising capital expenditures. So I think capital investment also is likely to be sluggish in the medium term. This makes the access by Australian businesses to global capital critical to support the capital-intensive export industries that create so many of our jobs. So what does that mean? Sorry to say this, it means our company tax rate of 30% is way too high. It's much higher than the OECD average of 25% and the 22% across Asia today. The US says their federal company tax will go to 15%, and cuts are planned in the UK to about the same level, and France, and even being considered in Germany. So my next policy prescription is for a 25% company tax rate as soon as possible for all businesses to lead to stronger investment, higher wages and more jobs in Australia. This is not trickle-down economics. Stronger investment delivers a direct benefit to workers and government revenues grow as economies expand. So the economic context has changed. This actually gives the potential for new policy settings to drive more sustained workforce participation by groups not equally represented in paid work. To make additional labour another factor in rising income again. Now, the Graduate Institute, from who I've drawn this material, has estimated the greatest contribution to increased GDP can come from increasing workforce participation by women and older workers. So I thought I would unpack this and see whether it made sense. Because in fact, since 2005, absolute workforce participation has declined and unemployment has risen. And the problem that we are facing is that as our population ages, this is going to get worse. So demographics imply an income drag. Although Roy Morgan research very recently shows that the expectation of working life length is increasing, which I think is around uncertainties in superannuation settings and so forth. A few years ago, 2008, people expecting to retire in the next 12 months averaged 57.5 years of age. Today, it's already up to 61 years of age. So it feels like the contention that we need to get older people into the workforce may be quite a sensible one. I would like to really, though, focus on how we might get more women in the workforce, because as a nation, we are not capturing the full economic potential of our female talent pool compared to many of our developed world peers. You can see us, the second chart from the left, and look at France, where 43% of GDP is driven by female participation compared to 35% in Australia. This type of inclusive workforce participation, I believe, drives social as well as economic benefits. And you might be surprised to see child development down the bottom there as a social benefit of increasing workforce participation. But it is shown that children that are outside the home for a proportion of their very early years do develop quicker, tend to be much cheaper to run as a citizen over their lifetime, lower healthcare costs and make a greater contribution to the workforce themselves. But really it's social engagement that I'm interested about, because I think this fights populism. And of course there are economic benefits to individuals working, which will remove inequality across our population. That's another populism buster. I think we need to have more haves than have-nots in Australia, and I think that should be a national KPI. We think a lot about the people that need the national safety net, not so much about how to help those people jump out of the have-not into the have bucket. And Stephen talked about some of the new attitudes that we're seeing. Ipsos Mori did a global study just before the US election. They headlined it, "Potential for More Political Uncertainty Ahead." I think that's certainly come true as a prediction. But they surveyed more than 1,000 Australians, and 60% of those people polled agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, "Traditional parties and politicians don't care about people like me." And that 60% was actually a few points below the global average. So sorry, Stephen, not 40%, it's 60% plus. 48% of the people who were surveyed believe that their life will be worse than their parents'. And I think this is the belief that strikes at the core of the lack of consumer confidence that we see in Australia. 68% of Australians polled said they believe that our economy is rigged to the advantage of the rich and the powerful. So we need to stamp out inequality. This is a major theme in the EPO chapter, engaging communities in economic reform, and I would commend you to that. So, the story of workforce participation in Australia over the last 40 years, it's very much a story of how women have engaged in the workforce. Women, and particularly mothers in Australia, could be forgiven for believing, as many people do, that traditional parties and politicians have not cared about people like them. Because while women are participating in much greater numbers, they are paid less overall, concentrated in lower paying industries, and more likely to be in part-time roles. In 1972, women made up 37% of the workforce, compared to 46% today. The increase in participation of mothers in the workforce has been stark, growing by more than 50% since 1981. I think, clearly there are shifts in the composition of the workforce, and they've been underscored by the changing attitudes to the role of women and increasing cultural acceptance of women pursuing meaningful careers. Back in the 70s, female participation was roughly half that of men, but it's not the case today. Now, this trend that we see in this Australian data is also evident in the United States, where labour force participation rates for men in the prime working ages of 25 to 54 have decreased from 98% highs, so pretty much the same as Australia, to around 88% today. There's a slowly decreasing trend line from the 1940s, but since the GFC, that trend line has actually steepened quite a lot. And some commentators in the US say that this is an underlying cause of the populist movements that elected Donald Trump. They worry about the disaffection of the men no longer participating. I, on the other hand, wonder why we haven't been concerned at the disaffection of women who were not participating for so many years. One cultural norm that hasn't changed enough yet is that the children penalty on participation is essentially carried by women. This is 2014 data. I haven't been able to update it because it's not readily available anymore. It appears to have gone the same way as the calculations of the women's budget and surveys of unpaid work, which are really good indicators of whether our norms are changing or not. But you can see there the participation gap between mothers and fathers. So cultural norms not changing fast enough. The trend in increased female participation, and particularly maternal participation, is observed globally. But you can see on this chart, Australia is sort of a bit below average in the middle there, and countries like the Netherlands, Iceland, Sweden and Switzerland have a much greater percentage. If you look at those countries and see what's happened to male participation, this increased maternal participation hasn't been at the expense of male participation. The rates there are the highest of the OECD economies. But what all this does is generate very different workforce participation for men and women in Australia. Women, as you can see, are the vast majority of part-time employees and often seen as only capable of bringing home a less important and second income. And that's what drives into the earlier conclusion that Australia is not getting its full economic potential of all of our female talent. So it's all very well to admire this wondrous problem. What can we actually do about encouraging participation? Let's look first at the workforce, the workplace. So this data from WGEA looks at for-profit entities with more than 200 employees. And actually, I think this might be this data's first outing. It shows that while progress is being made, those are the numbers at the bottom in the dark blue bubbles, showing increasing female participation, the representation of women declines at each step of increased seniority in a company. Even though a great deal of focus has been set on the governing body, the board, the decrease occurs at that level as well. So, why is this so? Personally, I reject the hypothesis that women are opting out, don't want these roles, are too busy, want to stay at home with the kids, etc., etc. I believe women are making it clear they only want to participate on an equal footing. They won't play unless the personal business case is positive. Why would anyone work for less money for the same work with less opportunity purely because of their gender? So have a look at this. Some Productivity Commission estimates show the startling cumulative impact of nearly $2 million for the typical mother over a lifetime of earnings. You can see it's been done against a number of scenarios. So, there is an individual business case for women. Is there a business case for all of us? It's still consistently challenged by some who favour the status quo, but to me, it's intuitively obvious that allowing well-qualified female employees to leave the workforce and not return after a child-rearing career break must have costs. US studies show the cost of replacing a worker is 10 to 30% of their salary. So what could companies do? First, have flexibility for both men and women. Companies with a greater range of flexibility arrangements, as reported in the WGEA surveys, have more women in their talent pipelines at all levels. That's the blue bar on the chart. Flexible offerings are really broad. That could be carers leave, unpaid leave, telecommuting, job sharing, part-time, flexible work hours, or a compressed work week, and so forth. Each one of those things that a company puts in will account for a few percentage point increase in the representation of women. There's also quite a number of other small investments companies can make that really move the dial on ensuring that women come back into the workforce after childbirth, such as providing breastfeeding facilities and referrals to various support centres. I'm a great fan of unisex toilets because it gives you an entire another piece of real estate to put your breastfeeding facilities into. I know it always gets a bit of a giggle from a few people, unisex toilets, but a lot of companies actually do have them. And I particularly like this data from a survey by the National Australia Bank, which lists the benefits accruing if you can have access to more affordable childcare. They've seen morale, productivity, lower administrative costs, and reduced levels of absenteeism being cited by businesses who have been able to get more affordable childcare or who are looking for it. So let's have a look at the macro picture. And that last chart gave a hint to what is the big thing that can really move the dial in this area. Because unsurprisingly, families say that childcare affordability is a major barrier to increased participation. For those already in the workforce in particular, that's the right-hand chart with that big blue bar saying, cost way too expensive. It's the second most important reason after a preference to care for your children yourself for those who are not working. And if you need more convincing, the behaviour of mothers actually tells the story. Working mothers use childcare more than non-working mothers. It does facilitate participation in the workforce. And that sounds like a bit of a circular argument, but if you think it through, you will see what the data is telling you in that mother employed and the childcare access by age of child on the left-hand side of the chart. The other interesting thing that's been going on in the 18 years up to 2014 is that there has been an almost 80% increase in the use of formal childcare. So what has been driving that? McKinsey did some analysis for me, which shows that what actually drove the great shift in childcare into the formal sector was government intervention. So we can see the power of providing subsidies, tax rebates and so forth. Because there's more than 600,000 families who receive government payments to support childcare services covering over 1.3 million Australian kids who are enrolled in an approved childcare service. Government sought to encourage participation by providing financial support to families through subsidies for in-scope childcare services, that's the childcare benefit and rebate, and tax concessions in the family tax benefit. $7 billion each year goes out on childcare to increase participation and promote child development. 80% of that is direct subsidies to families, and the state governments provide additional funding support directly to preschool programs. So it's very clear that the solution in large measure to increasing workforce participation lies in government intervention being more nuanced. And I'm concerned that the current set of proposed changes, while sort of heading in the right direction of simplicity, are a set of negotiated outcomes unlikely to be particularly effective. Because what this government intervention did, as well as increasing the use of formal childcare, was it increased the cost of childcare. It was demand priming. And you don't need to be an economist like Michael to know what happens when you radically increase demand without increasing supply. And the other thing that it's clear no one predicted was that parents using formal childcare could end up with out-of-pocket expenses that average 9% of family disposable income and as high as 11% in remote areas. So, unsurprisingly, Australian childcare fees are well above the OECD average. Now, the way the benefits landscape interacts with the cost of childcare shows why parents are disinclined to re-enter the workforce, particularly the full-time workforce. Because as you go into the workforce, higher taxes, lower childcare assistance. And what it actually does is it creates an economic disincentive to a mother working. So this is done for a single mother, so someone that you would think has a pretty high incentive to work. And it shows that the economic disincentive is 80 to 100 cents in the marginal dollar past the break point of 3 to 4 days worked per week for second income earners. And so the combined effect of childcare expenditure, tax payable and childcare benefits withdrawal creates an issue that's pretty much insurmountable for many people. So do we care? McKinsey did some modelling that looked to see if we could perhaps unlock this disincentive. They took some quite conservative productivity commission analysis and applied some simple average assumptions to show that we could get ourselves to a $2 billion annual improvement in income in the economy if we could just unlock another 32% of the 5.4 million partnered women back into the workforce. So, a final word from me. I hope I've made a bit of a case here that there is a business case for gender equality, but I don't think overall the case is really made well in a quantitative sense. So, hence this work, a bit of an attempt to put some rigour, to do what Stephen was challenging people to do, to take a position, get some data and make an argument about what your position was. But I'm sure that there are many people in this audience and many in the broader audience for the EPO who will remain unconvinced. I'm convinced that increasing female workforce participation is a thin edge of our economic wedge. If we can deliver equality to 51% of the population, I think we can deliver equality to all. And I think we can make sure, Michael, that we get year 26 and we get year 27. But the other big prize for us is that if we can have this inclusion and we can ensure opportunity for all, then we're going to remove the opportunity for populist nonsense. I think this is the key to increasing prosperity across Australia. Thank you.